Hello and welcome to another edition of Between the Rows, the podcast of Glacier FarmMedia. I'm your host this week, Gord Gilmour. In this episode, we'll be talking to Manitoba pulse and soybean growers agronomist Megan Burns about the results from their on-farm research network. I asked her what this season's most unexpected finding was.
I knew it as soon as I was standing in the field collecting our harvest data at one of our dry bean nitrogen fertility trials. That was the biggest thing that was unexpected for me this year.
And Market Farm's Bruce Burnett will tell us about the export taxes on grains that have been popping up around the world.
The biggest one in terms of impact on Canada has been actually the Russian export restrictions.
But first, a word from our sponsor.
I've been farming my whole life, and the one thing you can always count on is change. And now there's a new generation of inoculants from Lalaman Plant Care. New engineered granules and Lalfix spherical for pulses and soybeans that provide improved handling and accurate metering. New Rhizobium and Lalfix Pro Yield that deliver improved nitrogen fixation and iron uptake in soybeans. I've seen a lot of change, but this Lalaman company, well, this changes everything. Contact your Lalaman sales representative today.
This is Between the Rows. I'm your host this week, Gord Gilmour. In our last show, we met a professional barrel racer and discovered how she keeps focus on her sport over this COVID winter and her hopes for competing this summer. This week, we're posing the same questions to professional bull rider Jake Gardner. We caught up with Jake on a farm just outside of Fort St. John in northeastern BC.
So I come from three generations cowboy family, I guess you'd say, and my grandpa, he rode a bit of broncs. My dad, he rode broncs bulls and steer wrestled. And so when I was young, he kind of always packed me around to rodeos and introduced it to me at a young age, you know, kind of like anyone, got on sheep and steers. And then kind of when I was about 14 or so, started getting on bulls. My dad, he's a huge supporter, and he just told me not to half-ass it, to make sure that if I'm going to do it, to put all my ducks in a row and go after it. And I feel like he raised me to want to win, and that's how I want to be.
He is trying that man in that buck shoot, but it is a cowboy move. Come on, Jake.
Bull riding's, it's a high-paced sport, and it is dangerous. You crawl in that buck and shoot, and I feel like you kind of just let go of those fears of getting hurt. You just kind of get in the zone, and a guy will do whatever it takes to make the whistle.
That is what the championship round is all about. It is big time rides like that one that continue to define the career of a Canadian superstar in the making. If the question was ever, why did Scott Schiffner pick Jake Gardner for Team Canada, it's rides like that one, my man.
You ride a rank bull for 8 seconds and you get off, you feel like you conquered the world. The previous year before COVID, I think it was something like I got to 40 rodeos. And then on top of that with PBRs, there's more than 20 PBRs. So that's probably about, with rodeos and PBRs, the guy would be getting on at least 4 to 6 bulls a weekend. Sometimes we'd be going all the way out to Quebec, or, it'd just be right in Calgary. So it kind of varied that way. Me and my traveling partners, Nick Tetz, he's got a van, one of those Sprinter vans that's all set up. So it had bunk beds in there, so 4 or 6 of us bull riders or whoever would pile in there, and sometimes we'd go 2 weeks just staying in that van and cruising around and putting on lots of miles in that. So that's kind of what it was like in a normal year, anyways.
Okay, Alberta, how do you like BC now? Come on, pump him up.
Yeah, 4 bull riders in a van can be pretty hectic. Sometimes we had 6, so then it got real hectic, and it was tight quarters. And all of us bull riders were kind of like brothers, right? So yeah, we'd fight, but we'd always get along or have a wrestling match and settle it there on the side of the road. But I mean, that the last year before all this COVID come along was probably one of the funnest years of rodeoing. I felt like I was riding as good as I've ever rode in my life before. I was healthy. Started off the year, I was riding most of my bulls, and I felt really confident about the year, and was looking forward to it. And yeah, I mean, there was like I had a bunch of months filled with events, and we had, I think, one in Regina, and all of a sudden 3 days before, the world went on lockdown, and at first it was kind of confusing, but then it turned into 2 months, and then it turned into 6 months, and now here we are. Try and stay in shape and get on some practice bulls when I can. And for me, I like to do anything that involves like ranching or doing cowboy stuff. So riding horses, riding colts, and for me, that's kind of how I like to stay in bull riding shape, because it's get on a horse bareback. That's the closest thing to getting on a bucking bull. So I find doing that helps a lot. The year coming up for rodeo, I'm kind of uncertain about it, because it seems like it changes every month what's going to happen. Hopefully this summer we can get some events rolling. I'm staying optimistic and positive about it. I think that once these vaccines or whatever gets rolling out, that we'll be able to start having more events, and I feel like it'll come back. I think it might take a few years to get the ball rolling to where we were, but I mean, shoot, we're cowboys, so you get bucked off, you get back on the horse.
Jake Gardner, as bullfighters move on in and do a great job. Jake Gardner from Dawson Creek, British Columbia, is the 2018 Canadian All-Around Champion.
That was bull rider Jake Gardner from just outside of Fort St. John. You're listening to Between the Rows, and I'm your host this week, Gord Gilmour. Later in the show, Bruce Burnett from Markets Farm will tell us about how grain exporting nations suddenly want to put up export barriers. But first, here's Megan Burns of the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers to tell us about the fruits of their on-farm research network from this past season. Megan, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Megan, could you tell us a little bit about the On-Farm Research Network, how it's structured, where it conducts its research, and who's involved?
So the On-Farm Network is a network of farmer-funded and directed research focused on testing new products and practices for pulse and soybean production in Manitoba. So it's a by farmers, for farmers program that's based on 3 principles. First of all, it's participatory. Obviously, we need farmer engagement to make this program happen. It's also precise, and this is something we really pride ourselves on. So we are producing robust and scientifically sound data, and this really drives our third and final principle of being proactive. So we're generating data and information for farmers to help guide their management decisions on the farm, with the ultimate goal of improving their productivity and profitability overall. So MPSG started conducting on-farm research back in 2012, and it was in 2014, I believe, that the on-farm network was officially created. To date, we've done just over 360 trials in total, I believe, covering a wide range in topics in soybeans, peas, dry beans, and we're starting to dabble in faba bean trials as well. In terms of where the research is conducted, we really try to cover as much of agro Manitoba as possible so that we have a good spread throughout the province, and we're sort of being represented in each of Manitoba's ag regions. And then who does it? It's really a collaborative effort between the farmer and the on-farm network. So all of this is done with producer equipment. It's seeded by the farmer, it's maintained by the farmer, just like they would maintain the rest of the field. And it's also harvested by the farmer. So we in the OFN create trial layouts and protocols based on the question that we're investigating. And then the farmer establishes their trial with our guidance or the guidance of contractors that we use. And then we collect data throughout the growing season. So that's kind of one of the benefits of working with an on-farm network program is we have time to do all the things a busy farmer doesn't during the growing season.
And so can you give us just sort of a brief overview of the type of topics then that you've been delving into?
Sure. So trial topics kind of come about in a variety of ways, but the biggest factor is really producer interest is what's driving these trials. And we might gauge that interest in trial type from, discussions directly with farmers or discussions with agronomists about what their growers are asking them. But because this is a farmer-centric program, we aren't doing this research because we want these answers. We really are doing it to inform agronomic decision-making on the farm. So we cover everything from like seeding rates and row spacings to fungicide efficacy, determining whether biological products make a difference for yield, and lots of things in between. So we really try and cover a vast array of both sort of agronomic management trials and then product use trials every year.
You've included economic analysis for the first time this year. Why was that important? What are the sorts of things you're finding out by using it?
I think when you talk about agronomic decision making on the farm, you can't forget that, that decision is tied to an economic consequence. So the farm is a business at the end of the day, and protecting the bottom line while promoting agronomic productivity is critical. So we want the whole system to be optimized, and it's really hard to extract the full value of on-farm data without investigating that economic portion. Now, that being said, economic analysis is a bit of a tricky thing to include because it can vary so much farm to farm and year to year. So the economic piece of things is really comprised of a few key factors, I think. So when we're going about our economic analysis, the way that we're doing it right now, the way that we've tried it out for the first time, the first question we ask is, obviously, is there a significant yield difference between treatments? For example, if we sprayed fungicide on our peas, but yield was statistically the same between sprayed and unsprayed peas, then we don't need to dive any deeper. That management practice didn't make a difference in yield, so that cost of the practice is just represented as a loss in profit per acre overall. But on the other hand, where we have significant yield difference, we obviously want to know with our brief and simple economic analysis whether that increase in yield was enough to pay for the cost of that management practice. So, for example, if we have a significant yield increase with fungicide application, that's great, but did it pay for itself or more and give us a boost in profit per acre? So the way we went about it, we tried to choose kind of average values as best as we could kind of guesstimate for the cost of management practices and get a representative range of market prices for the commodities. So the point of our brief economic analysis is really to create a sort of baseline foundation for that economic interpretation of the results. And I think in terms of what we learned from including it in 2020, I think it just really validated the importance of examining that economic piece. So certainly not every time that we're seeing a significant yield difference are we seeing a benefit to the bottom line.
What were the highlights of the past season, and what was the sort of the things that were maybe a little unexpected?
Sure, yeah. I always have a tricky time paring down my answer to this question because to me, everything is interesting. 2020 really highlighted the importance of year-over-year research in an on-farm program to me. So I think it's important to assess management practices and agronomic decisions, even things like product performance in multiple years so that we're capturing response to these things under different growing season conditions. And the beauty of working with an on-farm network like us is you as an individual farmer don't have to do year-over-year research on your farm. You absolutely can if you want to, but we are busy compiling data over time and over space from all of these growers doing, similar trial types. So we're kind of taking care of that piece. But I think a really good example of this, so we had soybean row spacing trials again this year. So we started those in 2019, and then we carried on with them in 2020. And what was interesting is comparing the frequency of response to narrower row spacing in those soybean row spacing trials. So in 2019, we had just under 30% of our sites that had a significant yield increase with narrower row spacing. But in 2020, the frequency of response jumped up to 60%. So it was basically double the frequency of response from 2019. And, why is that? Well, we start to see the effect of growing season moisture there. So 2019 was generally really dry, especially for soybean producing areas. And in 2020, while moisture may still not have been optimal, it was kind of enough to push yield potential, just enough that we started to see a more frequent benefit to a management practice like narrower row spacing. So that was one thing that stood out, like I said, just the benefit of doing year over year research for these things so that we can kind of determine the effect that growing season conditions might have on these management practices. I guess another highlight would be, we also saw the importance of moisture within a growing season and how that can vary from region to region in the province play out in our pea fungicide trials. So we had several pea fungicide trials, I think 8 or 9 this year. And there were 2 of them up in the Swan River area in the Northwest, and they got just hammered with rain during disease development time. And those were the 2 sites where we saw a significant yield increase with fungicide application. And at all the other sites in the rest of the province where they didn't get as much rain during disease development time, didn't push that disease pressure, we didn't have a significant yield difference at those trials with fungicide application. So, just showing the importance of that growing season precipitation and the benefit of, the extent of information you can get through an on-farm network when you're doing year-over-year research, or even making sure that you have a good geographic spread. There's just more to learn that way.
And was there anything in the program this year that really kind of, as you were going through the results this winter, just kind of jumped out at you and made you go, what's that all about? Is that's something we're definitely going to have to dig into a little further?
Absolutely. I think I knew it as soon as I was standing in the field collecting our harvest data at one of our dry bean nitrogen fertility trials. That was the biggest thing that was unexpected for me this year in all of our results. So we had 2 dry bean nitrogen fertility trials. One of them was comparing 0 nitrogen, so an untreated check, with 35, 70, and 105 pounds. And we actually saw a significant yield decline for the highest rate of nitrogen at that treatment. So the 0 nitrogen and 35 pounds were yielding statistically the same. The 105 yielded significantly less, and then the 70 pound was somewhere right in the middle, kind of similar to both of those other groups. But we certainly weren't expecting to see a negative response to nitrogen. I mean, it's not 105 pounds isn't a ridiculous amount of nitrogen for a dry bean crop here in Manitoba. So not high enough to cause any damage or anything like that. So we weren't expecting to see that. And my best theory right now is that higher rate of nitrogen in combination with the growing season conditions just pushed vegetative growth a little bit too far. And then the seed just didn't have time to fill properly.
The Manitoba pulse and soybean growers, they might not have been the first, but they could be. They were certainly the first I heard of that was doing this sort of on-farm research with a grower network. But it's become very popular in the following years. Can you tell us a little bit about why that is and why it is something that growers and their producer groups seem to be very interested in pursuing?
Mm-hmm. So I think, like I've talked about, at its core, an on-farm network program or an on-farm research program should be by farmers and for farmers. So it's about extracting value for each individual producer who hosts a trial first, and then compiling that information and developing sort of your story across time and across space as your program grows. But I think it's that combination of informing grower decisions on a farm by farm and case by case basis for the choices that matter to growers and the challenges that they're facing on their farms. And then that in combination with these bigger picture questions. So it really works through multiple facets to provide value on the farm. And at the end of the day, that's what's most important to us as grower organizations, is providing support to farmers in the most meaningful and valuable way possible.
And so let's talk about the coming season. I'm sure, like most of us in the sector, here in January, you're already thinking about spring.
Oh, we are. Yeah. Planning is underway for sure.
So tell us a little bit about that. What are you planning for this coming year?
Yeah, so we'll certainly look to carry forward with kind of our staple trials that we seem to have a lot of interest in every year. And I think that interest seems to be growing almost with the incorporation of brief economics. I think those numbers can certainly catch attention. So these are things like row spacing trials and soybean, seeding rate trials. Seeding rate seems to be a hot topic amongst our grower membership right now. So certainly looking to continue with our fungicide trials, especially in peas and faba beans, dry beans and soybeans as well, if there's interest there, but I think peas and fabas will be our focus. We have dry bean tillage trials lined up again for 2021. And then, like we talked about, hopefully get some more interested growers in dry bean nitrogen fertility to try and figure out kind of what's going on there. And then, as always, we hope to get some producer questions that might spark a new trial type, maybe some aspect of soybean fertility, or starting to look at pea population. I think pea seeding rate and population trials would be very interesting, looking at the effects on standability, but also disease control, and then how all of that relates to yield. So we're certainly open to new ideas, along with carrying on with our kind of staple core trials as well.
So we've really just sort of covered the high points here today.
Yes.
Where can farmers go to find the sort of the full trial results?
The best place to go would be our website. So it's just manitobapulse.ca. And then you can navigate to the on-farm network portion. There's a button right in the top corner of the screen. And then once you're on that on-farm network page, you'll see a link on the right-hand side to take you to the research reports. So those are the single site reports. You can find reports for every trial that we have ever done in the on-farm network, dating back to 2012. And then also the 2020 results series. So those are the short videos, and they are short and they're really easy to digest. It's a very good way to get sort of an overview of the 2020 results, specifically for different trial types that you're interested in. So you don't have to watch all, 16 trial type results. You can pick and choose which might be applicable to your farm. But yeah, our website is definitely the place to go to find all of that. And I also always welcome, questions, comments, feedback, trial ideas, etc., to come directly to me via phone or email. So my contact information can also be found on the website.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Megan Burns is an agronomist with the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers. She heads up their on-farm research network. You're listening to Between the Rows, the podcast of Glacier FarmMedia. Bruce Burnett is a veteran markets analyst and Glacier FarmMedia's Director of Markets and Weather. He joins us now to tell us about why export taxes are suddenly being imposed on grains around the globe. Bruce, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here.
I've seen quite a bit about export taxes in the past couple of months, but I don't really understand what's happening. What are they? Who's imposing them? And what do they mean?
Well, I think the biggest one in terms of impact on Canada has been actually the Russian export restrictions. Basically, a couple of months ago, the Russians decided to limit their exports from February the 15th through to the end of their crop year, which ends in June, in order to make sure there was enough wheat supply around, both for human consumption as well as domestic consumption. As we moved along, the food inflation in Russia went up. So what they decided to do is install an export tax. So that's what they've done. They put an export tax not only on wheat, but also on vegetable oil and a few other things. So, but the primarily the one that this has impacted is wheat, because Russia is the largest exporter in the world, and that obviously is going to have an impact. There have been some other countries too. Ukraine is restricting imports or exports this year as well. It's more of a voluntary agreement, I do believe, but still, again, they've committed to restricting their exports in the coming months until the new crop is harvested. And Argentina jumped in recently and decided to ban corn exports. They've since relented a little bit on that, but again, a different part of the crop cycle. The corn crop has been planted in Argentina, and what they're worried about there is to have enough domestic feed around, because we're coming close to the end of their crop year and supplies are becoming limited. So most of this is designed to essentially prevent those exporting countries from running out of grain.
That's actually part of what makes this a bit surprising to me. They're typically exporting countries. You'd expect them to be doing what they can to push grain out. What's happened to change that?
Well, I think you can primarily link this back to governments looking at inflation, specifically food inflation in their countries. And essentially over the past year, we've seen a dramatic increase in food inflation. This has been caused mostly because of strong demand for commodities. And the primary instigator of this has been China, who's imported record amounts of oilseeds and grains this past calendar year. So that's sort of what started things. And if you add in, let's say in the case of Russia, they had a poor planting season this past fall for their winter cereal crops. So they're concerned about how good these crops are going to be this spring and how large the harvest is going to be. So they're taking this as a preventative measure to try to keep this food inflation lower as we go through the next 6 months to 8 months or so.
So what does that mean to a country like Canada that continues to export? It sounds an awful lot like it'd be a good and positive story for our farmers.
Well, I think it's certainly positive, and it depends again on what commodity that you talk about. But using wheat as an example, we've seen prices in Russia increase dramatically because they've decided to put in an export tax of 25 euros per ton on February the 15th, and then increase those export taxes to $50, 50 US, 50 euros, pardon me, a ton in March 1st. So we're seeing a dramatic increase in the price of Russian grain. That has had the knock-on effect of increasing prices both in Europe as well as in surrounding Black Sea markets such as Romania and Ukraine. So these prices have increased. Naturally, importers don't like this and are now searching around to find grain from other origins that hasn't gone up in price quite a bit. But of course, it's almost like a rising tide lifts all boats. We're seeing the world prices now for wheat move upwards as these export restrictions have gone into place.
And now, is that an important distinction for Canadian farmers? We, after all, don't typically sort of play in the same space as the Russians, so to speak. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, again, we have a higher quality wheat, and in terms of our exports, certainly higher protein, higher quality. But when you see the price for sort of the lower quality wheats move up, it has a natural impact of pushing the prices for the higher quality wheats up. Again, this year we have seen some very strange price relationships between high quality and low quality wheat. Those spreads have narrowed considerably. But again, as we move through the coming weeks and months here, I think you're going to see exports of Canadian wheat actually increase as we start to fulfill some demand from Asia here that's going to not be fulfilled by the Black Sea participants.
Well, thank you very much for explaining that all to us, Bruce.
You're welcome.
That was Bruce Burnett of Markets Farm, filling us in on an unexpected wrinkle in world grain markets. That's another edition of Between the Rows, the podcast of Glacier FarmMedia. I'm your host this week, Gord Gilmour, saying so long, and we hope you'll join us again next week.
I've been farming my whole life, and the one thing you can always count on is change. And now there's a new generation of inoculants from Lallemand Plant Care. New engineered granules and Lalfix spherical for pulses and soybeans that provide improved handling and accurate metering. New Rhizobium and Lalfix Pro Yield that deliver improved nitrogen fixation and iron uptake in soybeans. I've seen a lot of change, but this Lallemand company, well, this changes everything. Contact your Lallemand sales representative today.
Today's music tracks were Coming Back by Lobo Loco and Earth and Sun, Leading Me On by Derek Clegg, Acoustic Romance and Dusty by Crowander.